Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Kison Patel. Kison is the founder and CEO at DealRoom, a project management software for complex financial transactions. In addition to that, he is also the founder and CEO of Agile M&A, founder of M&A Science, a community of forward-thinking M&A practitioners on a mission to perfect their M&A practice. Kison is also the host of M&A Science podcast, an educational podcast exploring the world of M&A within industry leaders and practitioners. And he is also an author of several books, M&A Tactics and Agile and M&A. Kison, thank you for coming to our interview today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Boris.
Yes, absolutely. You have a lot of activities on your shoulders. So can you tell us from the beginning, at the beginning, because I believe with your background, we will have a very interesting conversation about M&A activities. We don't have very often such specialists on our show. Could you perhaps tell us a short story about your career path and what brought you to your current role, or I would say roles, maybe a lot of hats you wear as community manager, as a leader of a software company, and what have you been up to these days?
Sure. It's probably a pretty typical founder story. I spent about 10 years working in the M&A industry as an advisor. I ran a boutique practice focused on lower middle market transactions, specifically hospitality and small financial institutions. In that experience, I became familiar with a lot of the pain points in managing a transaction. And I got involved with a startup in the marketing space that got me familiar with the way software engineers would utilize these project management tools to manage developing software, which is where I got most of the inspiration for starting DealRoom in 2012 as the project management tool specifically designed for mergers and acquisitions. And that business had a pretty rough beginning. It was a lot of typical lessons learned as a first-time entrepreneur in the software space. Getting to build a development team that's productive was a lot of lessons learned. Getting to product market fit was a whole series of lessons learned. And then developing a go-to-market was another set of lessons learned. So the first 5 years of business were pretty stagnant, and we worked in an industry that's pretty conservative. You know, it's hard to be the new person on the block and get somebody to trust you with the $100+ million transaction. But we persisted and started getting some traction. And it was pretty early that we realized when working with corporations that they all had a different way of looking at M&A, and that the industry itself was very siloed. And the bigger underpinning problem we identified was this lack of standardization and best practices. So at the time, a friend of mine in marketing was encouraging me to start a podcast. And then we took the concept of marrying the two together, where we could utilize a podcast as a platform to enable practitioners to share lessons learned, so we can in turn identify what are the proven techniques and document them, which evolved into a full media business where today we run events. We've got over 350 published blogs, ebooks, 2 published books. And then we also have an online academy program for those that are new to M&A that want to learn, and existing practitioners to further develop their skills. And the software line also evolved, where in the early beginnings, we would focus on this project management workflow to solve for due diligence. When you approach a company and want to work with your team to make sure what's represented is true and accurate, identify risks, plan for your post-close activities. And that's where we built our product around, with industry is traditionally using Excel trackers and a virtual data room, highly inefficient. And then in taking that solution to market, we found adjacencies with the integration process. So we extended our product with functionality to have continuity between diligence and integration. And then over time, we added pipeline management, and the product evolved into a full lifecycle management solution today. So today we offer several different business lines. I know we mentioned a few in the beginning of the podcast, but most of it all rolls up into our brand M&A science.
Interesting. So you started as a software business, and you involved in the podcast, and you wrote some books, and you created the courses, and now you full media company, which with some software company within, right?
Yeah, you know, the interesting thing, Boris, is that they tie together pretty well, because we can learn about best practices from the education side of our business, and then in turn find functionality to develop on the software side to help standardize those practices. So example is the trend with OKRs, where a lot of organizations are, especially in the software space, they'll use OKRs, but in M&A, they'll utilize OKRs to objectives and key results to align the priorities and the value drivers of the deal, and use that to set the goals for the integration of the transaction, which is really good because it keeps everyone accountable, but also aligns around the big picture of the deal that they're working on. And seeing that as a trend, we've then in turn enabled that functionality in the software to standardize that practice. So it's interesting how things tend to flow into each other as they mature.
Yeah, I read actually, and I listened to some guys in the marketing. They say that every company now has to be a media company to survive this age of social networks and proliferation of kind of media, right?
It's getting noisy. Building your brand, building trust with your audience, creating content's the best way to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's dive deep into your specific knowledge of merger and acquisition, M&A. Can you please describe a high-level view of M&A and let us understand key steps in the process in nutshell? Probably maybe from a perspective of investment banking, because there are some selling perspective, some buying perspective. Well, let's first from investment banking perspective.
Sure. So let's look at it from both sides, the buy side and sell side. Most of the time, the investment bank tends to focus on the sell side. It tends to be more lucrative for investment bank to manage the sell side process. And when you look at the early part of that, for investment bank particularly, they need to start building the relationships for either privately held business owners that may be looking to sell, or private equity firms. And even for those principals involved, they should start thinking about the relationships with either directly with potential buyers or with the investment banks they may work with to take their business out to market to shop around for buyers early. I mean, you want to do that 1 or 2 years ahead of time. And I think with that, getting advisors looking for someone that has expertise in the industry. They've done M&A, but they know the industry, they know the players in the space. They have actual relationships with those potential buyers. As you move through the process, you typically want to start organizing your company information to start preparing again early. If you could even get somebody, maybe even a CFO that's gone through an M&A process to help with preparation, I think earlier the better. It's one of the steps that often gets overlooked is the early preparation. It sort of saves a lot of headaches down the road. And there could be some things even operationally that may want to be adjusted. But essentially, you're getting ready to present your company to a variety of different buyers with different levels of sophistication. And it's just like a house. You want to keep it clean for them to look at and get a good impression of. And then once you start going through that early preparation, you will go through a process to either, if you do decide to go engage with the bank, or you may start going directly and start courting some buyers. And there's different reasons for it. I look at it as a short view versus long view. In a short view circumstance, you're running a competitive process in a tight time frame, and you're looking to objectively get the highest price possible. Where on a long view, it may be more of a strategic reasons where you're primarily looking for the best home for your organization, so you can see the continued growth and success for the future of the business and the employees involved. In that case, it may be more valuable to spend the time, identify the potential suitors, the corporations in the space, get to know them, even foster some partnerships as a way to develop that relationship to understand what it's going to look like when organizations come together. But we'll walk through the auction process, and that tends to be pretty common as well. When you do decide to hire that advisor, you typically reach out to a number of them, maybe 3 to 6 different advisors, and they'll run what's called a bake-off, where these advisors will present their service offering to your management executive team. And within that, they talk about their experience and so forth in the space and the transactions they've done. But towards the end, they'll give you a range of value that they'd anticipate on getting for your business. And then that's where you want to make your judgment wisely. It's not always the one that presents the highest numbers, the best advisor to go with. Put a lot of considerations in what kind of resources they're going to have to support because this is going to be one of the larger, more complex transactions that your organization is going to go through, which comes with a lot of headaches. And you want to right size it. If you get a bank that's too big and your transaction is not that important to them, they might not staff it or give it enough attention. And if you get a bank that's too small, they might not have the right resources or expertise for the type of transaction that you're working on. So really getting one that's the right size, you feel that there's a good fit in working relationship and working with that bank. Then you typically execute an engagement letter. And then once the bank gets an engagement letter executed, they're going to start a preparation process of information where they're going to build a CIM, a confidential information memorandum, which is a book that really details a lot of information about the business. And they'll create a teaser sheet so they can send that initially to identify interest in the business. Once they do the preparation of this information, they may even start setting up a data room, and it depends on different banks have different practices on when they set up the data room, but they may start setting that up to organize your company's information. And the data room's one of the things that they use as an alternative to typical Dropbox because it's got additional compliance security controls, automated watermarking, very granular permissions, audit trails, so you know who touches what. And you typically would have a confidentiality agreement as a template that you'll build. So as the bank now goes into the marketing phase, they'll send this teaser sheet out with very basic information. It's not going to identify the company for sale, but gives a sense of the industry and some of the high level financials that would be enough to get a general idea if someone would be interested to learn more. And then as they identify those participants, they would have them execute a non-disclosure agreement. And those things can be negotiated on because you have different buyers. You may have buyers that aren't in your space where you're more comfortable sharing information. You may have buyers that are direct competitors where you may be more sensitive about the information you share. Mm-hmm. So those NDAs can be tailored and gives you an early impression of what it's like working with that firm. If it's tough to negotiate an NDA, you might have a lot more tough negotiations ahead. If it's an easier, straightforward, it lends to what that relationship's going to look like. As you get that NDA executed, you start providing a CIM, some additional information. Usually a bank would stage out a letter of interest as a step, which is requiring these prospective buyers to send in a formal written statement of their interest. And again, it could vary on banks. Some may require a range of a price that they would pay. Some may not. They just want something formally placed. And that's when they start building their funnel. They can really start shortlisting, say, okay, here's who we have that's really interested. Now we can open up additional information to them, provide them access to a data room, take some of their requests, because typically a buyer is going to request documents as part of their diligence that they can review. They may also follow up with clarification questions so that they'll submit those. And this is where a bank can be helpful, because having information requests from several potential buyers can be very inundating for organization going through a sale process. So having an advisor to help lift some of that off is really helpful. And then as you move forward to the next stage, which would be a letter of intent. And some banks may skip the IOI completely and just go straight to a letter of intent, just depending on how competitive the process is. And a letter of intent is when you put in a formal offer on the business that lays the general terms in which you'll conduct the transaction, would have a price on there. And that's when the bank would really start narrowing things down and present these letter of intents to their client they're working with, to identify who would be the right suitor. And it's not always the best price. You know, a lot of times the seller wants to have certainty to close. Somebody might have a highest price, but they don't have the confidence that they have the resources to get the deal done, or they're putting a lot of extra terms in there. Then it may, you know, warrant them to look at another offer that could be lower, but has a higher certainty, or there could be other factors in play where they feel it's just a better fit for the organization. So they'll go through and work with advisor on that assessment, and then accept one of those offers as for their letter of intent. And that's when they move into confirmatory diligence. And things really step up where the buyer is going to get more people involved. They may use some external resources as well to due diligence. Really what they're trying to do is identify risk. Diligence is minimizing your risk. You want to identify things that could go wrong. Nobody wants to buy a business and find a bunch of surprises that are expensive to resolve. So go through, identify as much risk as you can. And a good buyer should also be preparing for the activities that they're going to do once they close the business. They could be going through different activities to integrate the company. And it really depends on their investment thesis, because typically, especially in this competitive market, they're going to build a model that has a lot of assumptions on the synergies to capture, whether it's through cost savings, through revenue. And they want to be able to start actually planning while they're doing diligence on how they're going to achieve those things. And then when they get to that level of comfort to close, that's when the attorneys would have a contract to execute. And there's some steps along the way with details and disclosures and schedules for that need to be reviewed by both parties. They know what they're agreeing to, and then they'd actually execute and close on the transaction. And there's some variances on when they actually announce the deal, when they close the deal, and it really depends on the nature. You can deal with a public company where they may have some regulatory requirements for them to announce the deal ahead of time to get regulatory approval before they can close. There may be some other reasons why. And then you might do both. You might announce and close at the same time, as well, as we see with a lot of smaller private transactions. When we look at this too, I guess one thing to touch on is the different ecosystem of buyers. There's a lot of private equity activity, which they'll typically operate off of a structured fund, or they may be unstructured, and they assemble the funds as they identify opportunities. Those are really active in the space for acquiring companies. And then large corporations were often referred to as strategics. Those are another set of buyers. Again, large companies, they may have a stronger emphasis on the synergies that they can capture from that company they're acquiring, just based on what other ways that they can realize value from the business. So there are different buyers that have different considerations, and they have different approaches. A lot of times the PE firms are designed to move faster and are able to take different levels of risk, versus a larger corporation. They have a bigger entity, maybe even an approval process to move on those transactions. So nevertheless, both are pushing to get more and more competitive in this environment. But that's a rundown of what that typical buy-side process looks like in a banked process. If it's a proprietary deal, it's no bank involved. You may eliminate some of those steps that are designed for having multiple bidders and keeping it competitive. You may move directly to an LOI and confirmatory and close, and may actually have a longer time frame in those different stages to really do a thorough job.
Mhm.
Should we talk through the buy
Yeah.
side?
Let us, yeah, it looks like very sophisticated, complicated process. Let us just concentrate maybe on a few stages because we don't have time to elaborate on every stage. What you see, for example, as a seller, maybe it's as a seller of a business, what are most important risk for the person, and what are kind of red flags for him to approach a deal?
For the seller,
Yeah.
so I think the preparation is the biggest part that gets overlooked. If you're not prepared for it, it's going to be surprising on how much work is actually done. When you have buyers coming in, they're looking at every little thing in your company, and they're really trying to make sure they don't get something and there's a big surprise. To be able to respond to that volume of information requests, it requires a lot of resources, and you need to be prepared for it. There's going to be a lot of meetings because the potential buyers want to talk to management and want to understand what the qualities are of the management team and how they would continue the business with or without them. So I think those are the big things, just having the resources, the preparation, having the right advisors. You got to have a good lawyer that's got experience with it, whether he's a bank or not. Definitely have a good lawyer. That's a really important. That's may not be the company corporate lawyer. Find somebody that's got M&A experience in that space, have done similar types and size of deals. What else is a big risk? I mean, it is disruptive. It's hard for it to say, to going through this process, it doesn't distract. And I think that's one of the big things is keeping the resources there to entertain the process, but keep your operations going. That's where the advisors could be helpful, because if you do get distracted, it can impact the business performance, and that's not good. That could impact the value of the business. So that's one of the things, just understanding that is a really tasking process.
Mhm. Interesting. So I think the last few years were very active in the M&A activity, and we are now on kind of uh, special over the special boundary, I think, when the market is going, because the era of free money maybe is over behind us. And what you see on the market happening, as we see now 10% drop in the market and the stock markets, and what do you see any changes in the M&A activity, and what are the sectors in trend now? Probably, maybe it's interesting.
M&A is still strong. We still see a lot of capital to be deployed. When we look at private equity and the funds that they're raising, they're bigger, they're as big as ever. So
Yeah.
there is no shortage of capital out there in the market to be deployed. So I think that's what fundamentally is going to keep M&A activity strong. We saw last year as an incredibly hyper competitive year, and just very aggressive auction processes. And we still see that high level of activity. Things it's still early to get a sense if it's going to end up being as competitive, maybe a little bit softer this year. The sectors, we always see a lot of activity in tech and healthcare. Those sectors they're large sectors, they're very active sectors. So we anticipate seeing those as being the two hot sectors.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you a personal opinion on what is a commonly held belief in the area of M&A, or biggest misconception that you are strongly disagree with?
Oh, it's easy. Yeah, I think so. I think first time people that do M&A, they get excited about it. And I do feel like there is a pretty steep learning curve when doing M&A, that, the first deal or two, there's a lot to learn. So yeah, I definitely think just the preparation, what it actually takes to make a deal successful. I just see a lot of folks when you bring them in too, they tend to get overconfident when they're buying a company and going through it. Things are changing. Like, it's becoming so much more people oriented. It's not old days, you're buying factories and hard assets. You're really buying organizations that are organizations of people, people are pretty fragile. Like, you take ownership and they didn't choose to come work for you. So that loyalty and bond isn't quite there. So it really, the industry we see is changing itself, that it's moving from this finance focused on M&A to a people focus. I mean, I think organizations that aren't keeping up with that shift are really getting behind, and they're going to miss out on a lot of value on the deals that they're pursuing. Whereas the ones that really keep up with it, they'll see some more success both in near and long term. So I think that's the one thing, is building the maturity around the people experience when you do a transaction for the customer, for the employees and the vendors.
Interesting. So you certainly saw a lot of best practices and lesson learned in your in M&A, and you wrote actually a few books. Maybe you can, as a kind of to finalize, maybe you can provide us a few major takeaways for people who want to be involved. I don't know, maybe from buyer side or sell side. What are the major takeaways for them to take from this interview and implement in their business?
Yeah, I mean, I'll build off the people focused theme, because I think that's the biggest thing we're seeing. And it's really about unity, about buyers and sellers working together, because ultimately it takes both to make the deal successful. So starting off with, what's the end state? What are we trying to achieve here? What does that look like? And really crystallizing that end state and bringing it to the front end of the deal process, so that both sides of the executives can rally around it, but even define it. Start thinking through what's the outline of go-to-market going to look like that needs to be executed to achieve that vision. We'll center that from the customer, because each organization respectively exists to create value for their customer. What is that going to look like when the entities are combined for the customer? I think that, and then doing the preparation to be able to execute on that go-to-market or in the integration early. So as you're doing diligence in parallel, you're planning integration iteratively. You're taking that same information that you're learning and covering diligence and repurposing it to build your integration plan. Keeping a level of transparency where the company you're acquiring, you're not keeping them in the dark, but you can help them understand where they're going to fit into the company, help them understand your company as a buyer, what your business lines are, where they're going to fit, so that they can be aligned around the goal of integrating to help achieve that. Really keeping strong communication throughout this process. People take bad news better than you think. It's just when they don't hear the news, then that's when it creates the most uncertainty. I think those are the big things. We wrote a book around Agile, and it's more of a project management detail and how you approach this process and driving this change, but really shifting away from a plan-driven approach we've commonly seen in the industry, and to a model that it's often used with software engineers to respond to changes as they're happening. So as you get in software, as you get the feedback, can you iterate and evolve and improve the product, and also continuously prioritize your value drivers so that you're achieving things in order of priority. I think really similar applies with M&A. Can you keep the value drivers of the deal prioritized, clear, and transparent with your team, so that everyone's focused on the highest priority tasks through the process? And as they uncover more information, it's important to be able to act on the information as it's received, so that these priorities are updated and those plans can continuously get updated. I think those are the big things. That's big on communication. It's big on collaboration. It's similar to a lot of other projects to make them successful.
Interesting. So that's all my questions. And mainly, maybe if I forgot to ask you something and you would like to answer some, maybe that would benefit our audience.
Yeah, when I think about this with M&A, it's really unique, because we think of it as a financial transaction, that it should be all this quantitative data, but it's really not. At the end of the day, it's all about people working together. I think bottom line is if you can be empathetic, if you can put your agenda to the side and really spend the time to listen first, understand what the other person is thinking, how they feel, why they feel that way. Spend the time to connect, understand what their goals are, what challenges they have, and align yourself to help them with those goals and challenges. I think that's where you can push for a stronger approach to make these transactions more successful and drive the necessary change to get the best outcomes.
Fantastic. That's why you also creating a community for M&A people, just to keep people to be abreast on the latest development, right? So it's very a kind of modern way of doing business, creating a community for your potential clients.
Absolutely. I think really we want to get together the practitioners that are forward thinking in our industry so we can share practices and continue to evolve the space.
Okay, fantastic, Kison. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you a great success with your company and many other your enterprises like communities and podcast and book writing. So hope to involve you once more in our podcast in a few months, maybe.
Hey, thanks, Forrest. My pleasure. Thanks for letting me have the time to talk to you about M&A.
Thank you.